Welcome to Module 5.5.5, Anthophyta, the flowering plants. This group makes up the second part of the seed plants. Last time we learned about phylum Coniferaophyta and some of its relatives that make up the first part of the seed plants. Phylum Anthophyta makes up the second part, and the greater part by far. Phylum Anthophyta is commonly called the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, and this makes they have about almost 300,000 species, and these are described species that represent at least 90% of all plants. These flowering plants arose very abruptly in the fossil record, somewhere around 130 million years ago or so, and they quickly became the dominant plants on Earth. Because they underwent an adaptive radiation with the development of the flower, and that allowed a coevolution with insect pollinators. And so both insects and flowering plants underwent this rapid adaptive radiation. And the term angiosperm, angio means vessel, so angiosperm means vessel seed. And the seeds in members of phylum Anthophyta are enclosed in a fruit, and so the fruit is the covering or the vessel that is referred to in the name angiosperm. And it's important to understand that fruits are derived from flowers and that seeds are produced inside fruits in phylum Anthophyta. And just to show you a couple of examples, and let me also let me show you a couple of examples. So things such as large trees belong to this group. Here's a couple of examples of trees. It's hard to photograph trees. But then wildflowers. I could have showed you pictures of fruits and flowers of all different kinds. These flowers remind me of where I grew up in California. They have the California poppy, and then they have lupins, which of course in Texas are known as bluebonnets. Let's go ahead and look at the features of phylum Anthophyta. And there's only one phylum in the angiosperms, and it is phylum Anthophyta. And of course, this group includes the seed plant features as well as the features for kingdom Plantae. The Anthophyta have flowers, the only group of plants to do so, and these flowers produce fruits that contain seeds. A feature that's unique to the Anthophyta is double fertilization. We'll describe that to you when we discuss the life cycle. And one of the key features of the flowering plants is that they undergo interactions with other groups of organisms, especially with animals. And we'll talk about three interactions in particular. There are certainly others. And you should recognize that is the flowering plants that produce humans with most of the economically important plant products. These are the plants that primarily support us. That is, we eat them as agricultural products, and also many of the other products that are produced by plants come from this group. Because this is such a large group of plants, and we haven't done really much in-depth taxonomy of plants, we are going to look at two groups within the Anthophyta, two groups of angiosperms, the monocots and the dicots. And we're going to use these just as simple categories. We're not going to try, they actually do represent taxonomic categories, but we're going to just use them as a grouping. And so this is a major branch within the Anthophyta, monocots and dicots. And so we can divide these plants based upon a number of features. The feature for which the two groups are named are the cotyledons. A cotyledon is an embryonic seed leaf. So these are the leaves that are inside the seeds. Many students in their grade school days had the experience of planting, say, a bean seed in a Dixie cup full of soil. And when it sprouts up, it comes up with two leaves. Those two leaves are the two cotyledons. Those are the two embryonic seed leaves. And that would then mean that beans are dicots. Now, if you planted a corn seed and when it germinated, it would come up with one cotyledon. The problem with using a cotyledon to define a group of plants is you have to be there when the seeds germinate. If you're there later, you don't know how many cotyledons it had. So we correlate some other morphological features of adult plants with it. One of the features that we correlate with being a monocot or a dicot is a type of veins that a plant has. If the leaves have veins that are parallel, typically that is a monocot, while dicots typically have a net-like pattern in their leaf venation. Now, about the stems, we don't really care that much in this class, but there is a difference histologically. In dicots, the vascular bundles are in a ring, and in a monocot, the vascular bundles are scattered. But again, we don't care that much for Biology 101. The root systems tend to be a little different. Dicots more typically tend toward having a taproot. An example of a very exaggerated taproot is a carrot. It's exaggerated because it's a storage root, but that's the idea of one central root. While monocots tend to have a more fibrous root system where there's not one leader among the roots, and the roots are fairly equal and quite branched. But probably the most important feature used by botanists is floral structure. So if we look at the structure of the flowers, we find that monocots have their floral parts present in multiples of 3. So there's 3 petals or 6 petals or 9 petals, 3 stamens or 6 stamens or 9 stamens. While dicots have their flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5. Now, if we look over at the very right, there's some examples that are given. Examples of monocots include grasses. This includes the majority of grains, such as wheat and barley and rice, corn. All are grasses, and they're all monocots. Lilies, like we dissected in lab. Orchids, one of the very diverse groups of plants, together with the grasses. And palms, which I told you were seed plants, are indeed seed plants, but they are monocots, not dicots. Some of the dicots, most of the plants you would think of that don't fall in this list right here, would probably be dicots. Not all, but oak trees, bean plants, and other legumes, including mesquite trees, spinach, rose, many of the wildflowers are in fact dicots. We should recall that flowers are reproductive organs, and they provide attractants and rewards for pollinators. And do they always do this? Well, no. And I show you a picture of a grass flower because grasses are wind pollinated, and so they do not require insects, and so they don't provide attractants and rewards. So grass flowers don't produce nectar, which is only sugar water, and so a flower that produces nectar is only producing this sugar water as a reward. It has nothing to do with the actual reproductive structures or gametes. It's just that the nectar attracts insects that can serve as pollinators. We definitely want you to be able to draw a flower, and I'm trying to think, maybe, well, here I say flowers are sex organs. What are you saying when you give someone flowers? It's nothing really, but interesting to consider, because I know as a young man, 16 or 17 years old, giving flowers to that special girl, I would have been mortified with embarrassment if someone would have said, well, those are sex organs, something like that. But it is true that flowers are sex organs. And we happen to award them to people that we like because flowers are very beautiful. But they're not beautiful for us. We tend to be kind of egocentric in that way and think that all of nature is there for humans. In fact, flowers don't really care whether or not they're attracted to us. Here is the structure of a flower, and you should be able to draw this basic flower. I demonstrate this in lab, so you already saw me draw a flower, so I don't think I'm going to reiterate that here. But here are the parts and the structures. I will just go through them. I won't draw them. But the stem is called the peduncle. It has a swelling on the end called the receptacle, and then it has several whorls of modified leaves. The first of these are the sepals. These are the small leaves that are under the flower, and they can also cover the flower bud, and they are green and they photosynthesize and can help the flower develop. The next whorl of flower parts are the petals, and the petals are often large and colorful, and they serve as an attractant. In wind-pollinated flowers, the petals are often missing or else very small and nondescript. The third whorl of flower parts consists of the male parts, and it's like a little stick shift where the knob is called the anther, and that's what produces the pollen, and the filament is what holds the anther up. Together, the anther and the filament make up something called the stamen. And since this is the male part, it's nice that it has the word men, M-E-N, in it. Of course, the anther produces pollen. The pollen is a male gametophyte that contains sperm cells. The female structure consists of a base, which is kind of swollen, and it's called the ovary, and it contains within it immature seeds. On top of the ovary, connected to it, is a style and then a stigma. A stigma is a kind of a landing platform for pollen. So in order for pollination to occur, it has to get from the male structure to here to the stigma. Collectively, the stigma, style, and ovary make up the pistil. It's also called the carpel. I use the term pistil preferentially in Bio 101. And so those are the basic parts of a flower. You should be able to draw and label and explain the life cycle of a flower. One thing that you should understand is the difference between pollination and fertilization. Now, they vary both in geography, that is in location, in space, and they also vary in time. Pollination occurs first. In flowering plants, we would define pollination as the movement of male pollen onto the female stigma. We could make a more general definition that would apply to conifers as well, and say that it's the movement of pollen onto the female structure. In that case, it would be to the female cone, but nevertheless, you get the idea. Typically, we have an animal pollinator of some type, or perhaps an inanimate force, such as wind or water, that moves the pollen. Now, fertilization follows pollination, and this is a process in which the sperm and the egg fuse. And this is typically after a structure called a pollination tube grows from the pollen, and the process of fertilization will typically stimulate the fruit development. Now, an interesting question is what happens to unpollinated flowers? Unpollinated flowers will not produce fruits and will not produce seeds, and typically such flowers will wither and fall off the plant. And so it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So that's something you should know. Now, we told you in the features of phylum Anthophyta that double fertilization was unique to this group, and that is true. Now, in double fertilization, in fact, there are two sperm cells in the pollen tube, and both will fuse with other cells. One fuses with the egg and produces a zygote. The other produces with some cells and produces a triploid tissue. Because remember, the sperms are haploid, and if you have one haploid sperm and one haploid egg, they fuse and they produce a diploid zygote. If you have one haploid sperm fuse with two haploid cells, which is what happens to the other sperm, then you get something called endosperm, and it is triploid. Endosperm is the tissue which provides the food inside the seed. You will recall the definition of a seed included a plant embryo with food inside a seed coat, and so the endosperm provides the seed. So a real important thing to understand is, why does it happen this way? I just told you that flowers that are not do not undergo fertilization will wither and fall off the plant. Now just think what would happen if the plant had already invested a lot of energy and produced all the food, all the endosperm. It would lose all of that. But by having fertilization coupled with the production of the endosperm, it assures that endosperm is not needlessly and wastefully produced without a plant embryo that can potentially use it in a seed. So here is the life cycle of the flowering plants, and once again, of course, both the male and female gametophyte are produced on the sporophyte, the large plant, in this case in the flower. And one of the things that I want to point out to you here is the way that the pollen tube grows. So if we look, right on, this is the pistil of the plant right here. This structure is the female structure, and at the base is the ovary, but up here's the stigma. And so the pollen has to be transported by an insect pollinator or by the wind or some other force to land on the stigma. And once it is there, it will grow a tube, which is called the pollen tube, parasitically, and it grows down to one of the ovules, and there the two sperms inside it will fuse with the egg and the other cells to form the endosperm. And so that's how that happens. I want to show you where the pollen, I wanted to show you where the pollen tube is. And of course that's double fertilization, crossing the line of ploidy, and then you have inside the seed a little plant embryo with endosperm, the food that's around it. So, and it can grow into a new plant and produce flowers with a stamen that produces the male gametophyte in the form of pollen grains, and a ovary with immature seeds that will produce the female gametophyte inside the immature seeds. In any case, I didn't go into great detail there, but I told you the highlights, and we're going to conclude this module with that.